I have spent many years moving between hotels and motels, my experiences ranging from comfortable and carefully decorated to shabby and suspicious. But there is one hotel in particular that I have never been able to erase from my memory to this day. It was a small, isolated hotel located on the side of a long road that stretched through an area that seemed completely deserted. It had never been in my plans, but it suddenly appeared after hours of nonstop driving in an area where I could see no sign of towns or villages. I had no choice at the time. I was exhausted enough to need a break for just a few hours. I remember that night well, driving along a road that seemed to never end, winding through vast expanses of desolate land and dense forest. The road was shrouded in darkness, and the headlights of the cars could barely make out a few meters ahead of me. The feeling of emptiness surrounded me, as all I came across were worn metal signs or old, dilapidated barns, like ghosts looming over me from a bygone era. The further I went, the more it seemed that the road was not going to lead me to anything familiar, as if I was stuck in a closed circle of loneliness and silence. Suddenly, and unexpectedly, a glowing neon sign appeared in the distance. It was like a lifeline emerging from a dark ocean. I gradually approached and saw that the sign advertised the presence of a small motel. The place looked simple and dilapidated, an old one-story building with a limited number of rooms. In front of the motel, there were some old cars that looked like they had been parked for a long time, and on the sign was written the word "room vacant" in irregular, faded letters, barely legible. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the windows were dirty and had deep cracks on them, but I did not care about all of that. I was exhausted beyond words, and all I wanted was a place to lay my head and get some rest. As I drove up to the motel lot, the tires crunched the gravel, their screeching sound making an eerie sound in the otherwise quiet air. The air was surprisingly cool, even though it hadn't quite sunken yet. The sky was overcast, and a thick fog hung over the entire place like a veil obscuring reality. The only light that illuminated the place came from the neon sign, as well as a dim lamp hanging over the motel's main entrance, casting a pale yellow light onto the cracked pavement. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The door creaked strangely as I pushed it open. The interior lobby was very small, barely enough room for 2 people. The wallpaper was old and faded, showing signs of peeling from time. In the corner was a dusty wooden table with a few old, neglected flyers on it. Behind the desk was an elderly man wearing thick glasses that looked as if they hadn't been wiped in years. His eyes were barely visible behind the dusty lenses. When I entered, the man slowly looked up at me, his features as lifeless as a mask. "Do you have any rooms available?" I asked in a voice I tried to sound confident despite the strange feeling that was starting to creep in. The man nodded slowly without saying a word. After a long moment of silence, he reached out with a trembling hand and pulled out an old, battered notebook from under the desk. He slowly flipped through the pages until he reached a blank page, then handed me a pen without looking me directly in the eye. "Sign here," he said in a low, barely audible voice. I wrote my name in the notebook and handed it back to him. He didn't glance at the page I wrote on, but pushed it aside and grabbed a rusty key that was hanging on a hook behind it. "Room 6, he said, passing me the key. "No pets, no disturbances." "Thanks," I said, holding up the key, but he didn't respond. He stared at me blankly as I left the hallway. Room 6 was in the far corner of the building, next to a row of dense trees that loomed like shadows in the darkness. The door was old, with peeling paint. The number 6 was barely visible. When I put the key in the lock, it opened surprisingly easily. Inside, the room was as small as I expected. The bed was low and showed signs of overuse. The dresser was dilapidated, and a small television hung on the wall that looked like it hadn't been turned on in decades. The carpet was stained, and the wallpaper was peeling in the corners. The smell of mold filled the place, but it wasn't strong enough to make me reconsider sleeping there. I sat on the bed after dropping my bag, the sound of the mattress squeaking filling the room. I tried turning on the television, but it only played white noise. I turned it off and decided to lie down for a while. The place was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind that was howling outside seemed to be fading. I turned off the light and closed my eyes, but sleep refused to come. A sense of anxiety was dominating my thoughts, and there was something strange about the place, something I couldn't explain. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a soft knock on the door. The sound was barely audible, like the whisper of nails gently hitting wood. I felt a shiver run through my body as I sat upright on the bed, listening intently. The weather outside was windy and the fog was thick, so I tried to convince myself that the sound might just be a tree branch hitting the door. But something inside me refused that explanation. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate and measured. I slowly got up, my bare feet touching the cold ground, anxiety seeping into my veins. I took a deep breath and decided to face whatever was outside, no matter what. I walked with heavy steps towards the door, my heart beating fast as if warning me. I put my hand on the doorknob, slowly turned the handle, and opened it. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of thick fog, but there was no one there. The parking lot was completely empty, and the gravel glistened in the dim neon light like a sea of small stones. I stood there for a long few seconds, trying to make out any movement or sound. Then, at the edge of vision, I noticed a clear footprint in the gravel, large and seemingly belonging to someone standing near the door and then turning toward the trees. I quickly retreated inside and closed the door tightly. I was shivering, not from the cold, but from the fear that was beginning to take over my mind. I went back to bed, but sleep was the furthest thing from me now. The silence in the room was suffocating, and my mind would not stop analyzing what I had seen. As I tried to calm myself down, the sound came again, this time coming from the window. It sounded like fingernails tapping on glass. I froze, my hand slowly reaching for the flashlight on the bedside table. I felt trapped between the four walls, as if the room had become a prison from which there was no escape. With the beam of light coming from the flashlight, I turned my eyes to the window covered by a thin curtain. I saw something move, a shadowy figure standing directly behind the glass. I felt my breath catch. I tried to convince myself that what I was seeing might be a reflection or an illusion, but the instinctual sense of danger was screaming inside me. With a slow, cautious movement, I reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. The light filtering through the glass revealed nothing but dense fog outside. But in the lower corner of the window, there was a mysterious handprint. I couldn't bear to stay in that place another minute. I quickly gathered my things and ran to my car, and spent the rest of the night driving aimlessly away from that creepy hotel, vowing never to return. Despite the passage of time, the memories of that night still haunted me, and something inside me whispered that what I had seen was more than just a passing illusion. I've been a land surveyor for over 20 years, a profession that has taken me to remote places often untouched by human eyes, places shrouded in silence and surrounded by raw, unvarnished nature. I've assessed land, examined abandoned structures, and measured the ground under an unforgiving sun. In these remote areas, I've encountered strange situations, wild animals that pierce the silence, unexpected weather that defies expectations, and equipment failures that leave you isolated from the nearest sign of civilization. Yet none of these experiences prepared me for what happened to me once under a bridge in the vast Arizona desert, an experience that has left an indelible mark on me for all time. It was July, when the desert heat is at its peak. The sun there is not just the sun. It is a giant oven that melts time and transforms the landscape into a dancing mirage. Sand, rocks, and scattered shrubs glisten in the unforgiving rays. The sky, clear and unnervingly blue, stretches out like an eternal, cloudless canvas, as if closing the horizon in on itself. That day, I was assigned to inspect an old bridge spanning a dry riverbed 50 miles outside Phoenix. The bridge had been built in the 1960s, but neglect had left it looking like a relic from a bygone era. The site had been in use for years, making it an ideal location for me, who prefers solitude. The road led me deep into the desert, where the dirt path meandered into the shadows cast by the distant hills. The truck's tires kicked up red dust behind me, and the radio barely picked up a weak signal. But I didn't mind the silence. I welcomed it. There's something comforting about being completely isolated, with nothing to distract you but the sound of the wind and the whistling of hawks overhead. When I finally reached the bridge, it was well past noon. The heat was stifling, and the air shimmered on the horizon like treacherous waves of water. The bridge stood there, old and dilapidated, its metal frames covered in rust, the concrete riddled with deep cracks. It seemed to stand firm despite the neglect, a witness to a time that no longer existed. I headed to work under the bridge, where the shade provided some relief from the heat of the sun. That's when I noticed something strange. A large dumpster was sitting there, hidden in the shadows as if trying to escape sight. It looked strange and unexpected in the middle of the barren openness. The strangeness of the place prompted me to approach. The dumpster was old and dilapidated, covered in rust and random graffiti. It gave off a faint stench, a mixture of decay and neglect. Despite my hesitation, I decided to open it. I carefully lifted the lid, expecting to find some old trash or forgotten remnants. But what I saw inside the dumpster was completely different. Piles of torn clothes, dirty blankets, and empty food containers filled it, as if someone had been using it as a shelter. But what caught my attention most were the drawings etched into its metal walls. Disfigured faces, twisted bodies, and strange symbols I had never seen before. I stepped back, my heart pounding. There was something off about those drawings, like a testament to a confused mind or a lost soul. I tried to push away my troubling thoughts and focus on finishing the task. But as time passed, I found my eyes turning to the container, as if something inside was watching me. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on gravel. I froze, feeling my breath slow. The footsteps were getting closer, breaking the silence of the desert with a heavy sound. I looked around, searching for the source of the sound, but found nothing. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A man stepped out from behind the container. He was tall and thin, wearing torn and tattered clothes. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes held a strange look, a mixture of anger and madness. He stood staring at me, silent, as if time had stopped for a moment. I tried to stay calm. "Hello," I shouted in a trembling voice. "I'm just here to work. I'll be leaving soon." But he didn't answer. He just continued to walk towards me, his gaze widening, as if something dark was taking over him. I only had a moment to make a decision. I reached for the gun I kept for protection in these isolated places. I pointed it at him and shouted, "Stop!" But the man didn't stop. He just smiled. His smile was twisted, cruel, and cold. "You're no different than me," he said hoarsely. I fired a warning shot into the ground between us. He shuddered for a moment, then slowly turned and walked back to the container. I ran to my truck, my breathing quickening. When I started the engine, I looked back and saw the man standing beside the container, watching me with a steady smile. I've never been back to that place, but the memory of him haunts me whenever I find myself out in the open, where the silence is heavy, as if there are eyes watching you from the shadows. Going out on the water was an experience unlike any other, a contradictory mixture of deadly comfort and cold anxiety. Just being in a lake, surrounded by water on all sides, and giant trees watching you silently, felt like you had escaped everything that connected you to the world. At the same time, that isolation stripped you of all protection and left you alone in front of the unknown. The lake, with its endless stillness, gave off an unnatural feeling. Its peace might numb you, but behind that peace there was always something waiting to be revealed. Sound traveled easily on the still surface, as if nature itself was whispering to you that everything you heard might be the last thing you heard. Fishing had always been my favorite pastime, especially in isolated places. In those remote places, I felt as if the outside world was fading away, and all that remained was the water, the trees, and the sound of the fishing rod cutting through the surface. But one summer, a few years ago, everything changed. I realized then that there were places that were not ours, places that hide something we should not approach. The story began when my friend Mark and I agreed to explore a lake described to us by two locals in a nearby town. "You won't find it on any map," they said. "It's so far away, but it's worth the trip. The water is crystal clear, it's full of fish, and best of all, it's completely empty of people." It was an invitation we couldn't refuse, especially for fishing enthusiasts like us. We set off early one warm morning, carrying our gear, our tent, and some supplies. The road was long and winding, leading us deep into the forest where the trees seemed to arch over our heads, blocking out the sky. We could see the sun peeking through the dense branches, as if guiding us towards something. The further we went, the more we felt like we were leaving the world behind. When we reached the lake, the scenery was indescribable. The water was so still that it looked like a huge mirror, perfectly reflecting the sky and the surrounding trees. The setting sun cast a golden hue over everything, making the lake seem like it was from another world. We pitched our tent in an open space near the shore and got our fishing gear ready. As night fell, the stars began to shine in the clear sky, and it was a little chilly but refreshing. We decided to spend some time fishing before it got completely dark. We pushed our small boat into the water and began to row towards the center. The only sound was the clatter of the oars, as if all of nature was celebrating our silence. But the silence was heavy. No birds, no insects, just a deadly silence. "It's so quiet," Mark muttered, looking around. When we reached the center of the lake, we cast our lines and began to fish. The lantern cast a faint glow on the water, and the reflection of the light danced as if it was escaping from something invisible. At that moment, I saw a shadow on the far shore. It looked like a man standing there, silently watching us. "Mark, do you see that?" I said in a low voice. Mark looked, then nodded. "Maybe a local?" he said hesitantly. But there was something strange about his presence, his absolute silence, the way his features were not entirely clear. We tried to ignore him, but with every minute, his presence weighed more heavily on our chests. We decided to return to the beach after a short while. When we approached the shore, the man was still there. This time, I could see more of him, tall and thin, dressed in shabby clothes, his face expressionless. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances, and we quickly pulled the boat to the shore. That night, we tried to sleep, but we were constantly on alert. Suddenly, we were awakened by the sound of soft knocks on the tent. We froze in place, our hearts pounding wildly. Mark grabbed his flashlight and slowly opened the zipper, but there was nothing. Yet there were fresh footprints, leading from the water to the tent and back. Fear made us pack up quickly. As we left, I took one last look at the lake. It was completely still, as if denying everything that had happened. The way out was terrifying. The shadows seemed to move, and the trees whispered incomprehensibly. When we reached the city, we never spoke of that night again. But I have not forgotten the face, the silence, and the footprints that suddenly appeared. Sometimes, when I am alone, I hear the wind whispering to me as if to remind me, there are places you must not approach because they are not for humans. Over the years, my friends and I have ventured across countless trails, daring to camp in remote locations far from any traces of modern life. We loved exploring places that made us feel part of nature, and we considered these trips as little adventures that added a different flavor to our lives. But despite the many experiences and trips we took, there was one trip that would never leave our minds. That weekend trip that took us to an old, isolated cabin deep in the woods, a place we found in a mysterious ad on the internet. When we first saw it in pictures, we thought it would be the perfect escape from the stresses of everyday life and a chance to regain our peace of mind. However, what we knew then was that this trip would turn into a scary memory we would never forget. Our plan was pretty simple: drive to the cabin, spend the weekend hiking the surrounding nature trails, enjoy cooking simple meals over an open fire, and share some funny stories and maybe even ghost stories. The description attached to the cabin's advert said it was rustic and secluded, which is exactly what we wanted. A quiet place away from the noise and chaos, where we could relax and get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But the reality was different. The quiet we saw was not what we had imagined. It quickly turned into a deep sense of dread, as if the cabin was hiding something much bigger than we had anticipated. Our journey began on a Friday morning. We got in Aaron's old sports car, which barely had enough room for us and our luggage. We laughed and joked along the long drive, enjoying the fun atmosphere and the scenery that began to take on a more isolated form as we got deeper into the countryside. As time went on, the roads became smaller and narrower, and the usual houses and signs disappeared. Tall trees began to wrap around us as if to block out the sky, making us feel as if we were diving deeper into the heart of the unknown. The GPS began to emit intermittent signals, as if technology itself was afraid to enter this place. As we approached the cabin, we had completely lost signal. When we finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set, spreading its golden rays through the tall trees, while casting long shadows over the old cabin. The cabin looked exactly as described: isolated, old, and long abandoned. The paint was peeling, and the porch seemed to be leaning under the weight of time. The windows were dark, like closed eyes watching us silently. I felt a twinge of anxiety as I got out of the car, but I decided to ignore it, assuming that the fatigue of the long journey was the cause. "Pretty comfortable, isn't it?" Aaron said with a faint smile as he looked at the cabin. His tone was sarcastic, but it didn't hide his true feelings. We all laughed awkwardly, trying to ease the tension that was unconsciously starting to creep up on us. We had no choice but to continue, so we grabbed our bags and made our way inside. Inside the cabin, we discovered that it was no better than outside. The furniture was covered in a layer of dust, and the floor creaked with every step. There was a musty smell in the air, making us feel like we had entered an old forgotten place. The living room was small and furnished with mismatched furniture, and the kitchen looked like it had come from a distant era, with old, rusty appliances. The atmosphere was eerie and uneasy, as if we had entered a place we were not supposed to be. However, we tried to ignore all of these feelings, thinking that they were part of the country cabin experience. By evening, we had lit a fire in the fireplace and began preparing a simple dinner. Our conversation was light, but there was a silent tension in the air. We decided to go out to explore the nearby forest before it got dark. The trees were thick and tall and seemed to close in on us. As we wandered, we came across a strange clearing in the middle of the forest. In the middle of this deserted clearing, there was a group of old gravestones, their inscriptions barely legible. We exchanged nervous glances and did not stay there for long. We returned to the cabin as the last rays of the sun set, and an uneasy feeling began to take hold of us all. Inside the cabin, we tried to entertain ourselves by playing cards, but every little sound, the creaking of the floor or the sound of the wind, made us jump. Suddenly, we heard a strange sound, slow footsteps coming from outside, as if someone was circling the cabin. We froze in our places, and when Aaron gathered his courage, he took a flashlight, and together we went outside to check. We found nothing, but that heavy feeling did not leave us. We went back inside, only to hear the sound again, this time from the upper floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving above our heads. Everyone froze in their places, panic taking hold of us. When those footsteps began to slowly descend the stairs, we did not wait a moment longer. We hastily gathered our things and rushed to the car. We drove away, leaving the cabin and all its dark secrets behind us. That night, we realized that there are places better left deserted, far from humans. Even today, the memory of that night still haunts us like a shadow that never leaves us.